The Denton family built everything on one idea, that the ranch survives no matter what. No matter the loss, no matter the cost, no matter who has to be left behind. And for decades, that idea held. Jacob held it. Kara held it. Spencer held it in the jungles and the wars and the grief that followed him everywhere he went. But here is the thing no one is really talking about. By 1944, almost everything that held the Denton family together is gone. The people who built the foundation are gone. The rules that kept everyone in line are gone. And what's left is a family that looks like the Dettons on the outside, but has been quietly, completely reshaped by 20 years of silence, sacrifice, and survival. This isn't just a new chapter. It's almost an entirely different story. And the question that 1944 is really asking isn't whether the ranch survives. It's whether the family that's left still deserves it. To understand what 1944 is really about, you have to go back to where 1923 left off and sit with what that ending actually meant. Because it wasn't a clean ending. It was a wound. Jacob and Kara spent everything they had to hold that ranch together. They buried people. They fought off men who wanted to take everything from them. They sent Spencer halfway around the world and watched him become someone none of them fully recognized when he came back. And when 1923 closed, the Denton Ranch was still standing, but the people who made it feel like home were already running out of time. By 1944, that time has run out. Jacob Denton would be well into his 80s, if not older. Kara would be the same. Realistically, neither of them is still alive, and that single fact changes the entire emotional landscape of the show before a single scene even plays out. Because Jacob and Kara were never just characters. They were the moral center. They were the people who made the hard calls and then carried the guilt so that everyone else didn't have to. They were the ones who knew why the ranch mattered and could explain it in a way that made you believe it too. Without them, there is no one left who remembers the beginning. No one left who was there when it was just land and a dream and nothing else. The weight of that absence is not something the show can just skip past. It has to be felt in every scene, in every decision, in every moment where a character reaches for guidance and finds nothing there. And that absence creates something the Denton story has never really had before, a genuine leadership vacuum. Every generation before this had someone at the top who everyone else organized around. Someone whose word was final. Someone who the ranch moved toward, not away from. In 1944, that person does not exist yet. The next generation has to figure out what they believe and what they're willing to fight for before anyone earns the right to stand where Jacob once stood. That process is going to be messy. It's going to involve conflict, miscommunication, and almost certainly loss. Because that's how Dettons learn. They don't learn from advice. They learn from consequences. Spencer Denton is still alive in 1944, and he matters more than almost anyone else in this story, but not in the way you might expect. Spencer is not a ranch man. He never was. He was a hunter and a soldier and a man who processed his grief by putting himself in situations where death was the most likely outcome. He survived World War I. He traveled the world killing things for money. He watched the woman he loved, Alexandra, die in ways that no one should ever have to witness. And even after all of that, he came back to Montana not fully healed, not fully settled, but because there was nowhere else left to go. By 1944, Spencer would be in his late 40s or early 50s. He is not the young, reckless man from 1923 anymore. But he hasn't become Jacob either. He's something in between, a man with experience and scars and a very specific kind of wisdom that comes from having survived things that should have killed him multiple times. What makes Spencer's position in 1944 so fascinating is that he has a child, or possibly two. And yet the details around those children are complicated, in ways the show hasn't fully explained yet. We know he never remarried after Alexandra. We know he has a child with a widow. which is a detail that raises more questions than it answers. Who is this woman? What happened to her husband? And more importantly, what does that arrangement look like 20 years later? Because a child born from that kind of situation, outside of a formal marriage, outside of the clear Dutton line, is already walking into the family with a complicated identity. That child doesn't have the same straightforward claim to the ranch. That child grows up knowing, on some level, that they are different. And by 1944, that child is a young adult, old enough to feel that difference, old enough to ask questions about it. That tension between belonging and not quite belonging is one of the most powerful things 1944 could explore. Because it doesn't require a villain. It doesn't require anyone to be evil or even particularly selfish. It just requires two young people who both love the same land and both have some claim to it and both grew up with slightly different versions of the story of what the Duttons are and what they stand for. The conflict that comes from that is the kind that doesn't resolve cleanly. It's the kind that follows a family for generations. And looking at what we already know about Yellowstone, where the legacy and the land and the question of who deserves it never fully stops causing pain, it seems pretty clear that 1944 is where that particular wound first opens. But the character who might hold all of these threads together or pull them apart isn't Spencer. It isn't even his children. It's someone who left Montana in grief and silence, and who 1944 might finally be bringing back. And if she comes back changed, the way this story clearly needs her to be, then everything we think we know about where 1944 is headed might need to be rethought completely. Elizabeth Strafford left Montana at the end of 1923, carrying something that most people never fully recover from. She didn't just lose Jack. She lost the life she had built herself toward, the future she had traveled across an ocean for, the version of herself that existed in relation to him. When she walked away from that ranch, she wasn't being dramatic. She was trying to survive. And the fact that 1944 is set 21 years later means that if Elizabeth comes back, and everything points to her coming back, she is not the same woman who left. She has had 2 decades to become someone else, 2 decades to grieve, to rebuild, to figure out who she is outside of the Dutton story. And that version of Elizabeth, the one shaped by all of that time and distance, is a completely different narrative force from the one we last saw. Think about what Boston would have done to her. She came from that world originally. She knew how to move in those spaces. But she also knew, after everything she experienced in Montana, that the world of Boston dinner parties and proper society was a kind of lie. She had seen what real survival looked like. She had watched people she loved fight and die for something that meant more than money or reputation. Going back to that environment after all of that would not have felt like coming home. It would have felt like wearing a costume. And Elizabeth is too sharp, too self-aware, to wear a costume for very long without feeling suffocated. So the question isn't whether she comes back. The question is what brings her back, and more importantly, what she is when she arrives. The ranch needing her is one answer, but it's too simple. Elizabeth wouldn't come back just because the ranch needs someone. She would come back because something specific happened that she couldn't ignore. Maybe she got word that Spencer was struggling. Maybe she found out about the child. Maybe something about the war and the next generation returning changed the calculation for her in a way nothing else could. Whatever the reason, when she walks back through that gate, she isn't coming as a grieving widow looking for comfort. She's coming as a woman who has survived her own version of everything the Duttons have been through, and who has decided, finally, that she's ready to be part of it again. Her dynamic with Spencer is where things get genuinely interesting, and not in a predictable way. The obvious move would be to turn their relationship into a romance, to people shaped by loss who find their way to each other because no one else understands what they've been through. And that version of the story isn't wrong, exactly. But it also isn't surprising. What would actually be more powerful and more in keeping with the tone of this universe is if Spencer and Elizabeth operate as something harder to define. Not quite a couple. Not just friends. something that functions like a partnership without ever being named as one. To people who have both been through the kind of loss that permanently changes your relationship with attachment, and who have found a way to be close without risking that kind of devastation again. That dynamic would say so much more about who they've both become than a straightforward romance ever could. And if Spencer's child with the widow is being raised alongside Elizabeth's son or in some proximity to each other, then that creates a kind of blended family structure that the show has never really explored before. The Duttons have always been defined by bloodline, by the clarity of who belongs and who doesn't. But 1944 would be introducing children whose belonging is more complicated, more emotional, more dependent on choice than biology. And that is a genuinely different kind of Dutton story. It's asking whether family is something you're born into or something you build. And it's doing that in a historical moment when the entire world is being rebuilt around questions of what is worth preserving and what has to change. The World War II backdrop matters enormously here. And not just as historical texture. The young men of the Dutton line, Spencer's son, Elizabeth's son, possibly others, would be exactly the right age in 1944 to be part of what was happening in Europe and the Pacific. The Normandy landings happened in June of 1944. The war was at one of its most intense and defining moments. And for a show about legacy and sacrifice and what one generation passes to the next, having the Dutton heirs be part of that moment is almost too perfect to ignore. It doesn't have to be the center of the story. But the fact that these young men have gone off to fight, have seen things that cannot be unseen, and are now coming back to a ranch that is supposed to represent everything worth fighting. For that is a narrative set up with almost unlimited emotional potential, because the hardest part of war isn't the war, it's the return. It's the moment when the noise stops and the adrenaline fades and you're standing in a place you've loved your whole life and suddenly you can't quite feel it the way you used to. Spencer would know that feeling better than almost anyone alive. He carried it through the 20s and 30s. He built his whole identity around not sitting still long enough to let it catch up with him. And now, in 1944, the same thing is coming for the next generation, and Spencer is the only person on that ranch who might know how to help them through it. But here is what makes that complicated. Helping someone else through their trauma requires confronting your own. And Spencer has been avoiding his for a very long time. If 1944 is the story of the next generation coming home broken and the previous generation finally deciding to face what they've been carrying, then what happens when Spencer realizes he can't guide anyone through something he never got through himself? That question is the emotional engine of this entire show. And the answer, whatever it turns out to be, is almost certainly going to cost someone everything. Every Yellowstone story eventually comes down to the same brutal truth. The ranch demands sacrifice, and it doesn't care who it takes. It took people in 1883, it took people in 1923, and 1944 will be no different. The only question is who. And the more you think about which characters are most narratively valuable as losses, the more one name keeps coming up, the one character whose return would mean the most, and whose loss would hit the hardest. Elizabeth coming back to Montana only to be taken away again would be one of the most devastating things this franchise has ever done. And this franchise has done some genuinely devastating things. But it would also be completely consistent with the way this universe operates. The Duttons don't get to keep the people they love most. That seems to be the rule. Jacob and Kara built something extraordinary together and then time took them. Alexandra came into Spencer's life and was ripped out of it in the cruelest possible way. Jack and Elizabeth found each other and that was stolen before it even fully began. Every great love in this story exists under a shadow. And if Elizabeth comes back, healed and changed and finally ready to be part of something again, the shadow over her would be enormous from the moment she arrives. But loss in 1944 won't only be personal. It will also be structural. The ranch itself is going to face threats that are different from what Jacob faced in 1923.